When I opened my eyes, the light above me was blinding, and the first thing I felt was the pull of bandages against my scalp. My breath came out in short, uneven bursts as I realized I was in a hospital bed, the sheets stiff and cold. My mother leaned so close I could smell the perfume she wore every Sunday, whispering that I should tell everyone I'd fallen down the stairs because my father's promotion was being finalized next week. Her voice shook, not with worry for me, but with the panic of someone rehearsing a lie. My father stood at the end of the bed, hands in the pockets of his pressed slacks, nodding quickly when the doctor entered as if to take charge of the story before I could speak. "She tripped on the last step," he said. His tone clipped, the words practiced. The doctor introduced herself as Dr. Olivia Myers and began checking the monitors beside me, asking questions I struggled to answer while my mother kept repeating. It happened so fast. We barely caught her. I wanted to believe them. Yet the throbbing in my skull carried the memory of shattering glass. Not carpeted stairs. Dr. Myers adjusted the light and frowned, saying quietly that the laceration on the crown of my head didn't match a fall from that angle. My mother's face tightened as if the doctor had crossed a line. "We found her at the bottom," she insisted. But the doctor's eyes lingered on the fragments still tangled in my hair. My father cut in sharply that it must have been debris from the hallway cabinet, promising to handle any further questions. The doctor simply nodded and scribbled a note, her expression giving away nothing. When they stepped aside to speak in hushed tones near the door, I stared at the reflection on the monitor beside me. Dried blood crusted along my hairline, a faint shimmer of glass still clinging to the strands. My pulse quickened with the thought that I had woken up in someone else's version of what happened, that my injuries were evidence rewritten into a story about clumsiness. The sound of my mother's whisper returned, soft but commanding. And in that sterile light I understood what she truly meant. The truth would cost them more than my pain ever could. Dinner that night was a quiet performance under the yellow light of the dining room, each of us pretending to belong in the same scene. My mother asked if I'd heard back from the school district, and I said no. Still waiting. While Caroline smirked and said, maybe the universe was telling me to try something else. My father barely looked up from his plate, telling her to be respectful. But his voice lacked conviction. The same weary tone he used when discipline was just for show. Caroline muttered that it wasn't her fault if I couldn't plan my life better. And my mother filled the silence with talk about the church fundraiser, her eyes darting between us like she could stitch the cracks closed by smiling hard enough. When the plates were cleared, my father praised Caroline for her upcoming student teaching, reminding her that connections mattered more than test scores. She laughed and said she wasn't worried since Tyler was helping her prepare, adding that he'd been amazing both in class and outside it. My stomach tightened as the name fell into the air like a shard of something old. But I kept my voice steady, asking if she meant Tyler Brooks, who'd graduated from our high school. "You remember him," she said with a grin that wasn't quite friendly. "He teaches math now. Dad helped him get the position." My father nodded proudly, explaining that Tyler had potential and deserved mentorship. Later that night, from the hallway, I heard Caroline whisper into her phone, her tone shifting from sweet to sharp as she told someone that I'd moved back because my marriage had failed and I was broke. Then her voice dropped lower, saying she'd get the exam questions before Friday since Dad had the access codes and Tyler needed the answers to pass. I stood frozen in the dark, listening to her laugh quietly before ending the call. The sound was soft but cruel, the kind of laugh that carried the certainty of protection. I went back to my room and stared at the wall that separated us, realizing how much of this house was built on the appearance of order. The photographs in the hallway showed a smiling family that no longer existed, and the silence that followed her call felt heavier than the truth I'd just heard. I didn't know yet what I'd do with what I'd learned, only that it would change everything the next time we sat at that table pretending nothing was wrong. I waited until Caroline came home from campus, the tension already coiled between us like a held breath. When she dropped her bag on the chair, I said that I'd overheard her conversation with Tyler and knew what she was doing. She blinked, then smirked and asked if eavesdropping had become my new hobby, because maybe that explained why my marriage didn't last. I told her this wasn't about me, that cheating on a certification exam was fraud. And she froze for a second before tossing her hair and saying, "Everyone cuts corners when success is on the line." I told her that Dad's involvement made it worse, that she was dragging him into something that could cost his job. Her voice sharpened as she asked if I really thought I could lecture her after failing at everything. And when I told her I wasn't going to let her ruin our father's career, she laughed coldly and said I wasn't capable of ruining anything. I stepped closer, saying that she needed to tell Tyler to stop before someone else found out. But she leaned in until her face was inches from mine and said that I didn't have the authority to tell anyone anything. She called me pathetic for living in my old room again, claiming that I just couldn't stand watching her have the life I'd wanted. When I said that she'd started dating Tyler just to hurt me, her smile turned cruel and she admitted that maybe it had begun that way. But now it was useful he got his answers. She got her mentor, and Dad got his future department head. I said that none of it would matter once the truth came out, and she crossed her arms, saying that nobody would believe me, that people already thought I was unstable after the divorce. I told her that integrity still mattered, and she rolled her eyes, saying the world didn't reward honesty. It rewarded results. My chest tightened as I said that if she didn't stop, I would go to the school board myself. She called me dramatic and said I'd only make things worse, that she'd make sure everyone knew I was having another breakdown. I warned her that I'd talk to Dad that evening, and she shouted that I'd regret it, that I should learn to keep my mouth shut for once in my life. I followed her up the stairs as she stormed away, insisting that we could still fix this if she'd just admit it. But she spun around at her bedroom door, her eyes blazing, and hissed that I was nothing but a jealous failure who couldn't stand her success. Before I could answer, she slammed the door with all her strength, and the decorative glass panel shattered, raining down sharp fragments. The sound was a sudden explosion of light and pain, and as I stumbled backward, I felt the world tilt and go silent except for the ringing that followed me into darkness. When I woke again, the hospital room was dim and humming with low machines, and my mother was smoothing the blanket over my arm as if that small gesture could erase what had happened. My father stood near the door, his voice calm but rehearsed, saying I'd fallen down the stairs and hit the table at the bottom. I said I remembered glass, not stairs. But he smiled tightly and told me head injuries distorted memory. That trauma made people mix things up. My mother leaned close, whispering that the important thing was to keep the story straight, because the superintendent board reviewed his promotion next week, and no one needed confusion, ruining our family's good name. Dr. Olivia came in soon after, asking to examine me without my parents present. And once they stepped out, she lowered her voice, saying my wounds didn't match a stairfall. I told her the truth as best I could, that Caroline had slammed her door and the glass shattered, that I'd fallen backward before everything went black. She wrote something down and said she was required to report discrepancies, then asked gently if I felt safe. I hesitated, staring at the IV line in my arm, before saying I wasn't sure anymore. When my family returned, Caroline looked pale, her eyes red from crying, and she whispered that she couldn't sleep thinking about me getting hurt. My father said the doctor might ask me more questions, and it was best to stay consistent for everyone's sake, adding that the hospital often misunderstood cases like mine. I said I wasn't confused, that I remembered what happened. But my mother pressed her hand over mine and said memory after a concussion was unreliable and that I shouldn't let stress make things worse. Caroline's voice cracked as she begged me not to destroy Dad's career over an accident. After they left, The nurse named Danielle adjusted my IV and whispered that she'd seen my mother going through my phone earlier while I was asleep. I asked why she hadn't stopped her, and she said quietly that some families couldn't accept reality when it threatened their image. She leaned closer, telling me that my CT scan showed glass fragments still embedded in my scalp, then asked if I wanted her to document a statement in the chart to protect me. I nodded, though my hands trembled, realizing for the first time that the truth now lived inside machines and scans instead of the people I trusted. The nurse smiled faintly and said that was sometimes the safest place for it, then turned off the light, leaving me in the soft pulse of monitors that no one could argue with. It was close to midnight when the door opened quietly, and a familiar voice said my name. Soft and hesitant. Mark Sullivan, the imaging technician, smiled like someone remembering a different time, saying we'd been in the same senior class before life scattered everyone. He told me my father had been at the nurse's station earlier, insisting that parts of my chart were inaccurate, demanding they correct the record to match his version of events. I asked how he knew, and he said he'd made a copy of the data logs before anything could be changed, then slipped a flash drive into my hand and whispered that he'd rather get fired for telling the truth than watch someone bury it. When he left, I opened the file on my tablet and saw my X-rays glowing in cold white and gray. The pattern of glass fragments was unmistakable, clustered near the crown of my skull where Dr. Myers had said the impact occurred. A notation from her report read consistent with overhead glass shatter, not stairfall, and my breath caught at the sight of my own injuries, confirming what I already knew. I pressed my hand against the bandage, feeling the pulse beneath it as if my body itself had kept the evidence safe until someone finally asked to see it. The next morning, Detective Naomi Price came in with a small notebook and the kind of patience that made people tell the truth without realizing it. She asked me to describe what happened in my own words, and I said that Caroline had slammed her door, that the glass broke, and I'd fallen backward before losing consciousness. When she mentioned that my parents claimed I'd tripped downstairs, I told her there were no stairs where I'd fallen, only the hallway table where I hit my head. She nodded slowly and said that matched the medical report, then asked if I knew why the family might delay calling for help for nearly 40 minutes after the injury occurred. I said I'd heard my father's voice through the haze of pain, telling them to wait and think about what to say. And Naomi's pen stopped moving for a moment. She looked up, saying they'd confirm that through the emergency call record. And I realized the walls of protection my family built were already beginning to crack. She promised to follow the evidence, not the story, and thanked me for trusting her. After she left, I sat in silence, the faint hum of hospital machines steady as breath. Knowing the proof of what happened was no longer just inside me, it was now part of the official record, a version of truth my family couldn't rewrite. When I walked into the house, the air felt heavy with something unspoken, and my father was already waiting in his chair, as if the verdict had been rehearsed. He said the district attorney had offered him a deal, that all this could end quietly if I retracted my statement and told the detective it was a misunderstanding. I told him there was no misunderstanding, that the medical evidence was already filed, and he said I didn't understand how much was at stake, that decades of work could vanish because of my stubbornness. My mother murmured that families survived worse by sticking together, and I asked if she meant lying together too. Caroline sat on the couch with her hands twisted in her lap, her eyes rimmed with red, saying she never meant to hurt me and that everything had spun out of control. I told her I believed she hadn't meant to, but the problem was what came after. When they decided my silence was worth more than my safety, my father said I was being dramatic, that I'd always exaggerated, and I told him exaggeration didn't leave glass buried in someone's scalp. He stood up then, his voice rising as he said, I was destroying the family over one mistake. But I stayed seated, reminding him that one mistake became many when everyone agreed to hide it. My mother pleaded that I let it go, saying no one would gain anything from dragging this through the public eye. But I said truth wasn't about gain, it was about ending the pattern that kept us pretending. Caroline looked up sharply, saying I was ruining everything she'd worked for, that her career was gone because I couldn't forgive. I told her forgiveness wasn't possible without honesty, and she whispered that she was sorry again, though her eyes still darted toward our father for approval. He said I'd regret all of this someday, that blood should matter more than reputation. And I answered that if blood mattered, they would have protected mine when it was spilling on their floor. The room went still, and I placed the flash drive on the table, telling them the files were already with the investigator. My father's expression collapsed into something I'd never seen, fear rather than anger, while my mother looked at the floor as if she'd found no safe side to stand on. Caroline reached into her pocket and handed me a small box, saying it was mine, that she'd kept it years ago and didn't know why. Inside was the silver locket from my childhood, still scratched where the chain had once broken. I thanked her, closed the box, and told them I hoped someday they'd understand this wasn't vengeance. As I walked out, no one followed, and the silence behind me felt less like loss than release. A year later, I stood behind a lectern beneath the pale lights of a conference room in Minneapolis, facing a sea of faces waiting for me to speak. The event host introduced me as someone who had turned a personal ordeal into advocacy, though the title still felt heavier than I deserved. I began by saying my name, and that I had once been a teacher who nearly lost her life in what my family called an accident. I explained that the X-rays from that night didn't just reveal a fracture, they revealed the truth that everyone else had tried to hide. I told the audience that the evidence had spoken when words failed, that the medical records and timestamps had given shape to what fear had silenced. A young nurse in the front row nodded when I described how one act of careful documentation can mean the difference between a story buried and a story believed. Dr. Myers and Danielle sat together, smiling with quiet recognition, while Mark stood near the back, arms crossed, a small gesture of support that steadied my breath. I ended the presentation holding the scan of my skull, saying, "Evidence doesn't lie, even when people do," and the room rose to its feet before I could step away. Later, as guests filtered out, I checked my phone and saw a new message from Caroline. She wrote that she was in therapy now, that she understood more than she ever did before, and that maybe one day we could meet again. I didn't reply right away. I simply looked at the words until the letters blurred. When I finally walked outside into the cool air, I felt the weight of that small locket against my collarbone, its chain repaired, the metal warm from my skin, carrying a past that no longer owned me but still reminded me where I'd come from. Thank you for listening to my story and for staying until the end. If it reminded you that truth still matters even when it costs something, then it's done what it was meant to do. Share it with someone who might need a reason to believe again. I hope you find your peace too.